Welcome to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence. Join me as we venture beyond the mat into the fascinating intersections of yoga and health. Each episode brings you candid conversations with the visionary leaders and practitioners who are truly shaping this field, sharing their stories, insights, and the profound impact of yoga therapy in action. Well, welcome back to This is Yoga Therapy. Today we are joined by a yoga therapist who works at the vital intersection of trauma recovery, neurobiology, and the deeply human process of aging. Really beautiful intersections there. Meredith Phipps, who is a CIAYT and the founder of Essentia Yoga Therapy, has clinical practice, and over those years, she's dedicated herself to helping clients move from a state of bodily disconnection and survival to a state of connection, safety, and genuine awe. Her approach masterfully weaves together traditional yoga therapy, somatic practices, and polyvagal theory, helping individuals reforge a trusted relationship with their physical selves, especially when their bodies have felt like unsafe environments. And today we're going to dive into how bottom-up nervous system regulation transforms trauma recovery and how these tools adapt beautifully to aging bodies as well, and why building a completely new relationship with the body is often a radical, brand new concept for our clients. Meredith, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Michelle.
Well, let's get right into it. So you've got a wealth of experience in the world of trauma recovery, which is an area that serves as a core anchor for your practice. And many of our listeners are clinicians or advanced teachers, yoga therapists who know that trauma fundamentally alters a person's relationship with their own physical form. And so from a somatic perspective, what is actually happening when a client feels betrayed or disconnected from their body? And why does standard talk therapy sometimes struggle to reach that deep cellular level of survival?
Really great question. And I love, first, that we talk in yoga therapy so much about us not even being the end all be all in treatment, but that usually when somebody is experiencing their recovery journey from trauma, it's multifaceted and you have a lot of different modalities involved. So you may have talk counseling or talk therapy, and then you may have something like EMDR or, of course, yoga therapy or something somatic involved, because I believe it was Bessel van der Kolk who said that the body is involved in the trauma, the body should be included in the healing process. Really, what's interesting to me, and actually it was from the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that started me on a little bit of this track. There was an experiment done where we looked at the two sides of the brain when somebody is experiencing their trauma or their story of their trauma. And that right side of the brain, right back here, is actually actively involved when you feel threatened. Anything that's very, very similar to the trauma itself or a trigger doesn't even have to be exactly the same, just a tiny bit can trigger that side of the brain that this is happening right here and now. The left side of the brain, meanwhile, is completely powerless with all of its logic and reason to convince the right side of the brain that it's not happening right in this moment. And so what's really been beautiful is to notice how our somatic practices and including the body in the recovery process helps to realign those two areas of the brain to help the right side recognize that that was in the past, that it was dangerous, but it's not happening right here and now, and to help the left side and right side communicate well. So what I found in my practices is how beautifully that's done by somatic practice, by, of course, our yoga therapy practices, including those bodies in safe ways to rebuild that relationship.
Fascinating. And it just never seems to end for me, all of the ways in which yoga and yoga therapy are just such useful tools for so many different things. And now science is catching up, right?
Absolutely.
So in your work, you frequently utilize polyvagal informed tools, and you've noted that for many clients walking through your doors, tracking their own nervous system or understanding states like fight, flight, freeze is a completely brand new concept. We have to
Mhm.
remember that about our clients, even though we're so steeped in this, right? So when you're introducing polyvagal theory to someone who's actively stuck in a heightened defensive state, how do you break it down so it shifts from a complex clinical theory into a practical, accessible tool that they
Mm.
can feel for themselves on the mat in their bodies? How do we make these
Mm.
theoretical concepts really meaningful to our clients who are probably not familiar with them?
Yeah. Honestly, I would begin by saying that little pieces at a time, each client is going to be able to access that information a little differently depending on where they are. So I break it down very simply and I relate it to our yoga gunas. I also relate it to Winnie the Pooh. I mean, I make it as easy I'm a picture person, I'm a story person. I love to create some of those pictures. It's an oversimplification, but frequently that's where we have to begin, right? I've had to learn over the years that I can't hand my clients every piece of information that I have on something, but just like we do in yoga and we notice where we feel things and where our bodies are, where our minds are, how to make that next progression, we do the same with this with our clients. So I'll give you an example. I start with fight flight. Most people have heard the words fight flight, and so when I describe polyvagal theory, I may leave the word polyvagal out of it and just simply begin with our nervous system has two states: our autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic, which is usually what people think of as rest and digest, and sympathetic, which is what people typically think of as fight, flight, or freeze. But then I add, because this anchors for safety later on, I like to call that my get up and go, because it's not just linked to fight or flight. We actually need it to do things like get up and take the dog for a walk or get out of bed in the morning, or those things, or play, to be able to play and enjoy and have time with friends. That's part of that system. And then we simply go from there, even with a picture of the gunas. And I just introduce, in yoga philosophy, we have the gunas, which are energetic states very similar to our sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. And it's sympathetic is more like rajas, where we have that increase in energy, and we have a slower, more grounded energy on tamas. And then I go a little bit smoother, even just from there, I go a little bit deeper, and I like to relate it to Winnie the Pooh. So growing up listening to Winnie the Pooh stories, I like to say it's a lot like Tigger, Eeyore, and Christopher Robin. If Tigger is Rajas and sympathetic nervous system, and Eeyore is Tamas and parasympathetic nervous system, it's not that Eeyore is too depressed or Tigger is too much. It's that sometimes when we find that we have too much Eeyore and we're too down and we can't mobilize ourselves out of that, then we need a little Tigger to kind of balance us back out. And the other way around, when we have too much Tigger and we're way up here, we may need a little Eeyore. And so the middle ground is what we call Sattva. That would be like the Christopher Robin, that balance. From that moment, what I really like to stress is that balance itself is not something to be checked off. Like, I have achieved balance in my life. We talk about it in the Western world a lot like that. Like, someday I will have balance in my life, or I want balance in my life. And if you think about the idea of balancing on a balance board or on a ball, if you've ever done that, or even in tree pose, you can feel all those little micro adjustments that your body is making while you're holding that posture. And that's balance when we think of the gunas, right? It's little micro adjustments. I mean, sometimes it might feel like a great big giant adjustment, little bits here and there to find this beautiful balance in the middle, in the center, which we would refer to as regulation later on. So I offer little pieces of that as we go. We might start with a basic understanding and then add on to it. From there, as we introduce practices and how they feel while they're practicing certain practices, maybe a breath practice, maybe a mindful or meditation, maybe an asana, I like to talk about how does that feel in the body? Where does that feel like your nervous system is? Does it feel like a little sattva? Does it feel like you've got too much tamas? And we're able our clients are able to then see for themselves how these practices plug into the balance of their nervous system. So it's almost like learning the car, right? Like, this is when I need the brake, this is when I need the gas, then being able to find that balance.
I love the beautiful analogy, the Winnie the Pooh. I hadn't heard that one before. I certainly have heard the Guna's comparison, but not the Winnie the Pooh. That's really helpful. And
You
we
have the
always have to
Tao
meet
of
our,
Pooh's, or sorry, they have, sometimes there's a book called the Tao of Pooh.
oh
And
yeah.
so maybe we need a yoga therapy of Pooh.
Yeah, I
Either.
think so. We always have to meet our clients where they are, right? And
Mhm.
make things understandable to them. So, something I find beautiful about your clinical lens is how seamlessly your trauma recovery work crosses over into the world of aging bodies and progressive illness. Love to talk about that. We don't often see trauma and aging spoken about in the same
Mhm.
breath. So, how do the somatic tools that help a trauma survivor cultivate safety and also serve an individual whose body's changing, losing familiar capabilities, navigating the realities of aging and perhaps illness?
What I began to see in my practice, and I'm sure others have seen this in their own practices and working with clients, even in our own lives, is not that aging itself is traumatic in the same sense if we think of PTSD or TBI or those classifications, but or those diagnoses, but rather that there is an unfamiliarity all of a sudden with your body. The relationship with your body has
I
changed.
see.
Frequently, that can feel like betrayal. It can feel unsafe. It can feel unknown. And I've noticed that a lot of my aging body clients have struggled with the similarities. I mean, so many similarities between my aging body clients and my trauma recovery clients, in that it's their body becomes a scary place to be. They don't know what they can rely on it to do or not to do. They want to push it farther or not push it farther, and it's coming back to that same center of building a new relationship with your body. In trauma recovery, just the intensity of your feelings can be scary in and of itself. It's almost like like in the scary movies where the sound is coming from the basement and they start going, you tell them, don't go down to the basement. That's where the scary thing is. I think that's why we end up resisting working with our bodies sometimes, just the intensity of those feelings. And in aging bodies, I've found that it's similar, but the intensity could be anger or betrayal or confusion or even grief over what they've lost, capability that they've lost, coming towards the end of their lives. And so, looking at, yes, polyvagal, but also some of the beautiful philosophy in yoga of just the seasons of life, and going from, we have this 4 seasons of life in our yoga practice of our student life, right, until about from birth to about 25, and then our home builder, which most of us in the Western world equate life to that home building, right? When you're a student, you're building so that you can home build, so you can have a career, so that you can build your life, so that you can, I mean, just the fires of life going. And frequently we sort of end it there and not think, maybe we think into retirement a little bit, but you get into these other seasons of forest wanderer where you're not building your family or your career as heavily and burning those fires as much. You actually get to enjoy moving a little bit more into that vata space. Moving into that final stage is really this preparing for the end of life, preparing to meet your God, preparing to, come to that, to the end of what we know as of life. And when people move from one of those seasons to the other, it is very similar to triggering in trauma. Not, again, not in the same space that we think of like child abuse, but it is unsettling to the whole system and to the nervous system. What can I rely on my body to do? What is my purpose? Meaning, purpose, daily routines, all of those things begin to shift and change. So being able to bring these same practices in where we're building relationship with the body and we're using the gunas to find some of that balance, but in a way that is again, not, okay, we check mark, we found the balance, and now here we are, and we're going to hold this. But learning to communicate and respect and follow the inner voices that we're hearing in our bodies, being able, the inner sensations, and being able to trust those more.
Really beautiful. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think specifically of menopause and all the ways it can impact so many different facets of our being because the process is so comprehensive. So I think what you just explained there is really relevant at that stage of life too. So, as yoga therapists, our approach is inherently collaborative and highly personalized. Instead of forcing a client, which we would never do, into a rigid, predetermined shape, we adapt the framework to the unique individual that's sitting in front of us. So, when working with someone navigating complex emotional trauma or a changing physical template, how does this tailored responsive inquiry alter the therapeutic outcome compared to a standard general yoga class where it's
Mhm.
not necessarily individualized?
I think this is one of the reasons why I love trauma recovery and aging body work so much, and even illness. And it's not like it's, this is really fun work, but it actually is very rewarding work for that
Right.
reason. And because we can slow down to where that person needs to be. In a class, I have an arc that I'm following. I have a theme that I've set up before I know maybe who's even coming to the class, when I teach my classes. And those are fun, and I can do those things too and enjoy those. But what I love about yoga therapy in this space is being able to slow it down even beyond what I might expect for a client. I've had clients come in and I have an expectation of where we may go based on an intake form that I have or some conversations or prior sessions. And very quickly I have discovered, oh, I what I thought was slow down is up here to them. Like we need to really dial it back. For some people, that may be, if we came into trauma recovery or aging bodies with the idea that, well, we're going to start with breath, we're going to do these practices that we know increase parasympathetic activity and bring calm to the body. And we have that in our mind, but we're not considering the client. It can go very wrong very quickly. And I've seen shut down very quickly with that in mind. And so being able to observe the client with an open mind and open heart the moment they walk in the door. What is their demeanor like when they walk in the door? Are they distracted? How is their speech? How is their body language? What is all of that telling you about what the next steps are? And frequently that can rewrite what we're doing or what we have in our mind. A good example is, I've had clients who breathing is triggering for them. And so bringing breath into it or asking them to bring awareness to their breath is too much for them some days. And their trauma is to the extent where in polyvagal theory, we would say they've hit dorsal vagal reflex. So anything that is activating, like a little bit of noticing their breath or hearing their breath, shuts them down completely. So we may start with noticing what's in the room. We may start with just naming things, just look around the room: flowers, juice, stool, box, and beginning from that process. I can't do that in a class necessarily. I can definitely note the overall theme of the class or energy of the class. But I love that we can do this for our clients. And then that next step, really be able to empower them to take those next steps by asking, what do you notice? What would it feel like to try this? Or what do you notice when we try this? And then they begin to build trust within their own bodies. If you're trying to practice that, they're like, I don't like that. Or I'm starting to shut down, or I liked the other one better. Okay, let's go back to the other one. Then they're beginning to build that trust of their own inner awareness and their own inner voice. And so you begin to help them. You're really just the facilitator, helping them to build that strength and trust that hasn't been there before.
What a beautiful example of what we're talking about here. Yeah, thanks for illustrating that. And so you write really beautifully about helping clients view their bodies as a temple,
Mm.
which I think actually comes from the Bible, that phrase, right? But really a sacred space or a connection and wonder. However, in the West, many people are conditioned to look at their bodies with shame, criticism, or purely as something to be managed and controlled. So, how do we as practitioners help a client make that profound cognitive and somatic shift from managing a problematic body, like, my bad knee or whatever the language is or the mindset that we have, to standing in awe and reverence of its design? And I've used the word awe a couple times in the conversation with you, and I do love that word. And I also know there's some science behind it now too, as you probably do as well. But let's talk about the body in that way, to be
Mhm.
revered as a temple, a sacred space with awe, reverence.
Yes. This is probably hands down my favorite topic.
Mhm.
um, that comes from my own journey of coming from that space of feeling alienated from my body without even realizing it and feeling like it was not a safe space. Definitely going inward was not safe. I could talk about, and this kind of goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. I could have talk therapy, and with the trauma that I had experienced, I created my own script. So it made it easy for me to read off the script and talk about what was going on without ever feeling or actually accessing what was happening inwardly in my body. Through yoga, that's actually kind of where I started in my own yoga practice. Even just at a gym, I began to notice that the small shifts in my body, and with that began to change that relationship, which is really where the awe came from and that reverence. And it became this safe space, this sacred temple to be able to go inward into, that was not only safe, but powerful and
Mhm.
awe inspiring. And I spent a lot of time in the mountains growing up and just literally wandering in the mountains. And I feel that same sense of awe and wonder of what I was looking at in nature now in my body. It took a lot of years to get there, of course. So I think as practitioners, one of the best ways that we can help to invite our clients into that space and to help support them while they're creating that space for themselves is in a practical way. One of the things I like to do is when we are looking at any practice that we're doing, and we use the word notice a lot, but I like to invite them to notice anything that is neutral or even comforting. So maybe we begin with that practice, as simple as it is, of looking around the room because we're working with somebody who doesn't feel safe to go into the body. And we might begin with naming things just as they notice them. And then I go back and ask, are there any of those things that bring you a sense of comfort or even just neutral that feel safe to look at? And we begin to set it up there because eventually we're moving that into the body. If you think of doing a body scan, there's a beautiful practice. I did not come up with it, but a beautiful practice called the 4 Ns, where you're noticing what happens, a sensation in your body, and then naming that sensation, nurturing it. That may be placing a hand where you feel that sensation, and then asking what it needs. What does that sensation need? And I think the way that it was introduced to me, not it was not intentionally meant to be let's notice the negative things, but that's where our mind goes, especially when we're in that state, is to notice the negative. In my practice, I began to recognize that that was extremely uncomfortable and left the clients in a vulnerable place. So we would start with safety, and we would start with when they're in a place where a body scan is appropriate, notice anywhere in your body that feels neutral or that feels comforting or soft. And it may be their big toe. I mean,
Yeah.
it may be the tip
Yeah.
of their elbow.
But usually they can find something.
Yeah, and it might take a little while. That's okay to
Mhm.
give them that time and that space. I like to count in my head because I'm an extrovert and I love to talk. I like to count to like 14 or 15 in my head to give them that nice, slowly count 14 or 15 in my head to give them that space to think and to wrestle with that question. Because it's not always comfortable to say, can you find something that feels the immediate answer sometimes when you're experiencing discomfort in your body, whether it's chronic illness or aging or trauma, is to say, no, nothing feels comfortable. And just, but to give them that time to really find it in their body. And then that begins to create a new paradigm in the nervous system and the brain. We're rewiring and creating new systems where we're not only recognizing the negative, we're beginning to recognize the positive. And it has taken a while. I think with I've had some typical clients. When I say typical, I mean like who come for an acute care situation. They just had a hip replacement. They're okay to work again, and they're okay to work in their bodies again. Versus a trauma client, I may work with for a year or more, just depending on where they are. But for them to be able to look back and see how those shifts have taken place, and they have all these little tools in their toolkit now through their whole practice to be able to recognize how they made the decisions to shift in their, when my nervous system was starting to feel shut down, I used these practices and that really helped. When I started to feel agitated, I used these practices and this one didn't help as much. So I switched to that one and they begin to find self agency. And that, when they look back, all of a sudden, this awe sort of wells up. It's not something that we've created on purpose. It's something that wells up within them because they've been able to see that they've created that shift, that they've changed their own relationship with their body.
Wow, powerful. And that's how it works, isn't it? When they see that shift, right? We help them get there.
Yes. Yeah.
So thank you so much for your incredible intentionality, your clinical clarity, and for reminding us that our bodies are wired not just to survive, but to completely recover and restore. And I love to end the podcast by just getting a little more personal and asking our guests to share a bit about their own personal relationship with the practice and what your own personal daily practice is. As someone who guides others through deep somatic transitions, what does it look like for you? It must come first, right, before you do work with others.
Yeah.
How does it support you? I'd love to know a little more about that.
Yeah, I think that certainly that shifts and develops also through the years as my own relationship with my
Oh, yeah.
body continues to shift, right? I just turned 50 a year ago. So I turned 51 just a couple weeks ago. And I've really loved, there's something about 50 where there's this, I don't know, this shift to the other side
Yeah,
where
I've
it
been
just things
there.
are much more calm. So to go back to Winnie the Pooh, right? My dad used to read this story to me, Pooh Sticks. It's my favorite story. And they're watching the river. The story starts out by watching the river and watching the babbling brook. And the babbling brook is really just, it's going and it's going. It's got places to go because it's young and it's got to get there and it's got energy. And the river is slower and older and it knows it's going to get there when it gets there. I feel like that was the shift that happened when I turned 50. And I've loved that my practice has found this. There's just a non urgency to it's not that I have to do this or I'm obligated to do it or I must do this. It's a invitation and a welcoming. I find myself wanting to participate more in my practice. And so over the last year, that's really turned, of course, into asana, struggling with asana when you're in your 50s and perimenopausal and that's a real thing, right? Where my body is not doing the things that I wanted it to do or could have done, or it's just shifting and changing. And so I've added in Reiki practice to my yoga therapy practice or to my own yoga practice. And so I've found just a little soft movement, joint loosening in the morning. Those are real things. They're things I tell my clients, and I think I
Oh,
need
yeah.
to be doing those things too. And then shifting more inward, um, after I've had some movement in the morning, being able to sit with myself and even just, you know, Reiki is an energetic practice. So being able to just sit with the sensations that I feel in my body is a simple way for those who may not practice Reiki or may not have that in their life. Sitting with those sensations and being able to place a hand and work with the breath, I have found grounds me through the whole day. When I don't do it, I really actually I notice quite a bit. We just went through a whole interstate move. And so definitely noticed the days when I was able to bring my own practice in and days that I wasn't. But I will also say this, that for those days where we don't have, we don't feel like we have time or something happens and, your chaos reigns in the morning, I love the back pocket practices, what I call back pocket practices, or I've heard them called yoga snacks, or little pieces where I know, because I have that relationship with my body, I know that I can just take a breath and reconnect with my inner self. That's usually for me a hand on the chest and just a breath, and then listening for whatever feedback my body wants to give me at the time. So that's been years of developing that, but I'm really appreciating and enjoying that relationship with my body, that it's not just about moving in asana or, practicing a certain type of meditation, but it really is an everyday moment by moment conversation and communication with the body that I love.
So true and so beautiful. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and sharing about your work and your personal practice. I'll include these in the show notes as well, but for those who are listening and want to dive deeper into Meredith's work, she offers both in-person and telehealth sessions through her clinical practice. And you can find her workshop services, blog updates at yogatherapy.com. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it.
Thanks again for listening. If you're interested to learn more about who we are and what we do, check us out at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.